The disappearance of Sherri Papini, a story that shocked a nation and unraveled in a courtroom. On the morning of November 2nd, 2016, a woman went jogging near her home in Redding, California. She did not return. Her husband came home that afternoon and found the house empty. Her phone was later discovered on the side of a rural road, earbuds neatly wrapped around it. A strand of blonde hair tangled in the cord. Her name was Sherri Papini. She was 34 years old, a mother of 2 young children. Within hours, her disappearance became, within days, it became national news. Because Sherri Papini did not simply go missing. She was later found on Thanksgiving morning, 3 weeks after she vanished. Standing on the side of a highway, bruised, emaciated, with restraints on her wrists. She told authorities she had been abducted by 2 armed women. She described captivity, isolation, fear. The country reacted with sympathy and outrage. Searches intensified. Composite sketches were drawn. Roadblocks were set up. A community rallied. And then, years later, everything changed. But at the beginning, none of that was visible. Only a missing jogger, a husband speaking to cameras, and a town waiting for answers. Keith Papini reported his wife missing after she failed to pick their children from daycare. He used an app to track her phone. It showed movement along a rural road. That is where the phone was found, placed carefully. Not thrown. No signs of struggle in the area. No witnesses reporting a forced abduction. Still, the possibility could not be dismissed. Search teams deployed immediately. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Volunteers walked roadside ditches. The FBI joined within days because the disappearance had details that did not fit a simple runaway scenario. Sherri had left behind personal belongings. Her car was at home. Her children were young. Friends described her as devoted. She had not packed. She had not withdrawn money. The assumption leaned toward foul play. Keith Papini appeared publicly, pleading for her return. He spoke emotionally. He described his wife as strong and loving. He expressed belief that she would fight to survive. The media amplified the story. Missing mother, small town, mysterious circumstances. 3 weeks later, in the early hours of Thanksgiving morning, a motorist called 911. A woman had been found on the side of Interstate 5. She was thin, injured, restrained. It was Sherri Papini. She told law enforcement that 2 Hispanic women had abducted her at gunpoint. She claimed they had chained her, beaten her, starved her. She said she had managed to escape. The details were dramatic. Law enforcement treated her as a victim. Investigators worked to verify her story. Descriptions were circulated. Composite sketches were released. Communities across California were alerted. The case transformed from missing person to manhunt. But small inconsistencies began appearing. Her injuries did not fully align with her account. Her weight loss, while visible, did not match prolonged starvation. Surveillance cameras along the highway did not show signs of an abduction vehicle that morning. Still, trauma can distort memory. Investigators proceeded cautiously. They collected DNA samples from Sherri's clothing. They processed them, stored them. Years passed. The case remained technically open. The 2 alleged abductors were never identified. Then, in 2020, investigators ran the DNA profile through a national database. It did not match unknown suspects. It matched a known individual. A man in Southern California. When agents contacted him, the narrative shifted completely. He told investigators that Sherri Papini had not been abducted. She had been staying at his apartment voluntarily for weeks. The man was a former boyfriend. He provided details, receipts, text messages, evidence that contradicted the kidnapping story entirely. Federal investigators reopened everything. Phone records were re-examined. Financial transactions were reviewed. Statements were compared to physical evidence. The result was not ambiguity. It was contradiction. And slowly, the public narrative began to unravel. When federal agents contacted the man whose DNA had been identified, the case shifted quietly but decisively. He did not hesitate. He told them that Sherri Papini had contacted him voluntarily in late October 2016. She had asked him to pick her up near her home in Northern California. He drove for hours. When he arrived, she ran toward his car. She was not restrained. She was not injured. According to his statement, she asked him to take her away. He said she stayed at his apartment in Costa Mesa for approximately 3 weeks. During that time, she remained indoors. She rarely left. He described her as anxious and emotional, but not captive. He claimed she spoke about problems in her marriage. He said she asked him to help her disappear. Investigators cross-checked his claims. Phone records confirmed contact between them before the disappearance. Cell tower data placed his phone near Redding the day she vanished. Rental car records supported the timeline. The details aligned with physical evidence. Agents asked why he had not come forward earlier. He said he had been told the situation would resolve itself. He believed she would return home and explain things differently. He admitted that toward the end of her stay, she began harming herself. He said she struck herself to create bruises. He said she asked him to brand her shoulder. Investigators verified the branding. It matched an image she had provided during her initial medical examination. The implications were immediate. If the former boyfriend's account was true, then the kidnapping narrative had been fabricated. Federal agents re-examined the original interviews. They compared Sherri's statements over time. They looked for consistency. Instead, they found variations. Details shifted. Descriptions of the alleged abductors changed subtly. The timeline blurred. During the initial investigation, agents had treated her as a trauma victim. Now they reviewed those same conversations through a different lens. Money also became part of the inquiry. A victim compensation fund had provided financial assistance. Donations from the public had flowed in. Resources had been deployed across state lines. If the kidnapping was false, it was not only a personal deception. It was a federal crime. Investigators approached carefully. Cases involving alleged hoaxes carry risk. False accusations must be proven with clarity. In March 2022, federal authorities charged Sherri Papini with making false statements to federal agents and committing mail fraud. The affidavit laid out the evidence methodically. It included the DNA match. It included travel records. It included excerpts of her own text messages. One message, sent before her disappearance, referenced plans to leave. Another showed coordination with the former boyfriend. The public reaction was immediate. For years, the image of Sherri Papini had been one of survival. Now it shifted toward suspicion. Interviews from 2016 were replayed. Her descriptions of captivity were re-examined. Her emotional pleas were reconsidered. When she was arrested, she was released on bond. In court filings, prosecutors detailed how she had continued to repeat the kidnapping story even after confronted with contrary evidence. They stated that she had maintained the existence of 2 armed female abductors. There were no such suspects. There was no supporting evidence. Her defense initially suggested that she had experienced mental health struggles, that trauma could distort perception. But the weight of documentation presented a different pattern. Planning, communication, deliberate misrepresentation. In April 2022, Sherri Papini entered a guilty plea. She admitted that she had fabricated the kidnapping. She acknowledged that she had stayed voluntarily with the former boyfriend. She admitted that she had lied to federal agents. In doing so, she reversed years of public narrative in a single proceeding. The courtroom did not resemble the dramatic spectacle of earlier decades. There were no crowds filling balconies, no sensational testimony dominating front pages. Instead, there was documentation, evidence summarized, charges explained. The impact statement phase focused not only on financial cost, but on community trust. Law enforcement had diverted resources. The public had mobilized. Communities had feared an unknown threat. Those fears had been grounded in a story that was not true. The judge later sentenced her to prison time and ordered restitution. The financial penalty reflected the funds that had been spent during the investigation and compensation process. The sentence marked the official end of the criminal case. But it did not end the questions. Why create a story of violent abduction? Why maintain it for years? Why allow the fear of two fictional suspects to linger across communities? Those questions were not fully answered in court, because the court's role was not to analyze motive beyond what was required for conviction. It was to determine whether federal laws had been violated. They had. That determination closed the legal chapter. The emotional chapter, however, remained unsettled. After the guilty plea, the public conversation shifted again. For years, the disappearance of Sherri Papini had been framed as a violent crime committed by unknown suspects. Now, it was understood as something else entirely. Not an abduction, not a random attack, but a constructed narrative sustained over time. For her husband, Keith Papini, the shift was abrupt and deeply personal. He had stood before cameras asking for her return. He had described sleepless nights and fear for his children. He had believed the story she told him. Court records later made clear that he had not known the truth during those early years. The unraveling forced him into a position few anticipate. From spouse of a victim to public figure navigating deception. In statements released after the charges, he emphasized his focus on protecting his children. They had grown up hearing that their mother had survived a terrifying ordeal. Now that narrative had collapsed. The impact of that shift was not measured in court. It unfolded privately. Communities in Northern California also faced a recalibration. For weeks in 2016, fear had spread across neighborhoods. Parents warned children to stay close. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The alleged abductors had been described as two Hispanic women driving a dark vehicle. That description circulated widely. In retrospect, it had no basis in fact. Law enforcement agencies acknowledged the resources spent: search teams, helicopters, forensic analysis, interviews across counties. The effort had been real. The threat had not. Cases like this carry consequences beyond the immediate deception. They alter public trust. They influence how future claims are received. Investigators must balance skepticism with urgency. Too much skepticism risks ignoring genuine victims. Too little risks amplifying falsehood. The Sherri Papini case entered law enforcement training materials as an example of complexity. It demonstrated how a narrative, once publicly established, can shape investigative direction. It showed how sympathy can coexist with inconsistency, and how careful documentation ultimately determines outcome. Psychologists who later examined the case noted patterns consistent with attention-seeking behavior, but public diagnosis remained speculative. The court did not conduct a full psychiatric evaluation for purposes of legal insanity. The charges focused narrowly on false statements and fraud. The motive behind the fabrication remained partially opaque. Some observers suggested marital dissatisfaction. Others suggested a desire for escape. Still others pointed to deeper psychological factors. None of those explanations were tested under oath. In interviews conducted after sentencing, prosecutors emphasized documentation. Text messages recovered from phones, receipts and rental records, DNA evidence. They noted that the case turned not on emotion but on traceable data. The modern investigative environment had allowed the truth to surface years later. Without DNA database comparisons, the narrative might have persisted indefinitely. That fact unsettled many observers. In sentencing, the judge spoke about accountability, not only for the false statements, but for the ripple effects. Communities had experienced fear. Investigators had diverted attention from other cases. Public funds had been allocated. The restitution order reflected tangible cost. The intangible cost remained harder to measure. After serving her sentence, Sherri Papini would eventually re-enter society, but the case would remain attached to her name. Search results, court records, news archives. In the digital age, narratives do not fade quietly. They remain searchable, permanent. The broader impact extended beyond one family. Missing person cases rely heavily on public cooperation. Tips, shared images, community mobilization. When high-profile cases collapse, trust can erode. Future victims risk being met with doubt. That reality concerned many advocates. They emphasized that one fabricated story should not undermine response to genuine disappearances. The tension between caution and compassion remains delicate. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, its weight comes not from violence, but from inversion. The expectation of rescue turning into revelation. The shift from sympathy to skepticism. It is not the physical details that linger. It is the psychological reversal. The realization that an entire community rallied around a narrative that later dissolved. The disappearance did occur, but not in the way it was described. The captivity was described, but not in the way it happened. The case did not reveal an unknown predator. It revealed the power of a story, and how long that story can survive before evidence overtakes it. As time moved forward, the Sherri Papini case settled into public record. It did not remain active in the way violent crimes often do. There were no unsolved suspects to pursue, no cold leads to reopen. The evidence had spoken clearly. The court had reached its decision. Yet the case did not disappear quietly. It lingered in conversations about credibility, about trust, about how easily a narrative can take root when it aligns with fear. The original disappearance had unfolded during an era when social media amplified urgency. Posts spread quickly. Images circulated widely. Strangers became emotionally invested within hours. That speed created solidarity. It also created vulnerability. When the story collapsed, many people felt not just misled, but unsettled. If something so detailed, so public, so emotionally charged could turn out to be fabricated, what did that mean for the next missing person alert? Law enforcement officials addressed this directly. They emphasized that the rarity of false reports should not overshadow the overwhelming number of genuine cases. But they also acknowledged that each investigation must be grounded in evidence, not narrative. The Papini case reinforced that principle. It demonstrated that sympathy cannot replace verification, and that even a compelling account must withstand scrutiny. For the children involved, the case would remain part of their history long after headlines faded. They had experienced their mother's disappearance, then her return, then her prosecution. Those shifts occurred during formative years. The emotional complexity of that sequence does not resolve through sentencing. It continues quietly. Keith Papini later filed for divorce. Court documents reflected a desire for distance and stability. His public statements became more restrained over time. The spotlight moved elsewhere. But the record remained. For investigators, the case became a study in patience. The truth did not emerge immediately. It took years. It required technology that did not exist at the moment of disappearance. It required revisiting evidence without emotional investment. The turning point was not dramatic. It was procedural. A DNA database match, a follow-up interview, a comparison of timelines. And from those steps, the structure of the story shifted. Late at night, when this case is told slowly, it does not ask the listener to choose outrage or sympathy. It asks something more measured. How do we balance belief with evidence? How do we respond to dramatic claims without abandoning caution? And how do communities recover when trust is shaken? The disappearance of Sherri Papini was not what it first appeared to be, but it did reveal something real. The speed at which narratives form, the difficulty of undoing them, the way attention itself can become a force that shapes events. If you were watching the news in 2016, seeing the photographs, hearing the descriptions, would you have doubted the story? Or would you have believed it completely? And if the answer has changed now, what caused that shift? Quiet reflection on those questions is part of why this case continues to be discussed. Not because of violence, not because of mystery, but because of reversal. Because it reminds us that stories evolve, and that evidence, given time, can redraw what we think we know. As the night continues, this case does not end with fear. It ends with reconsideration. Thank you for listening.